The knife pressed against Seraphina's throat was silver. She could smell the metal's bitter bite even through her terror. Behind her, Marcus Blackwood's breath was hot against her ear as he whispered the words that shattered her world. "Did you really think I loved you, little wolf?" The golden-eyed stranger across Murphy's tavern moved like liquid shadow, and when he spoke, his voice carried the rumble of distant thunder. "Let her go, Blackwood. You have no idea what you're holding." Marcus laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. "Oh, but I do. I know exactly what she is." The blade bit deeper, drawing a thin line of blood that gleamed like starlight in the dim bar light. "The last of her bloodline. The key to everything my family has worked toward for 3 centuries. But as crimson drops hit the floor, something impossible happened. Where Seraphina's blood touched the ancient wood, silver light began to spread like wildfire, and every window in the tavern started to vibrate with a sound that wasn't quite human, wasn't quite animal, but something far older and infinitely more dangerous. The birthmark on her shoulder blade, the wolf print she'd hidden her entire life, suddenly erupted with heat so intense she screamed. And in that scream, something that had been sleeping for 3,000 years finally began to wake up. Marcus's confident smile faltered as he stared at the spreading light. "Impossible," he breathed. "The seal should have held for another decade at least." The golden-eyed stranger's lips curved into a smile that showed far too many teeth. "The wolf mother chooses her own time to return, Blackwood. And yours just ran out. Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in the Philippines, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. Chapter 1, The Scent of Truth. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps as Seraphina wiped down the sticky bar counter for the 100th time that night. Her small hands trembled, not from the cold October air seeping through the cracked windows of Murphy's tavern, but from the text message glowing on her cracked phone screen. "Found you, Sarah. Time to come home." Marcus had found her again. After 6 months of hiding, of scraping together rent money and living on day-old sandwiches, her ex-boyfriend had tracked her down to this forgotten corner of Portland. She pressed her back against the liquor bottles, their glass surfaces cold against her spine, and tried to steady her breathing. The bar was nearly empty except for 3 regulars nursing their whiskey and a man in the corner booth who'd been watching her all evening with eyes that seemed to catch the light like polished amber. The stranger in the corner had ordered nothing but black coffee for 3 hours, his massive frame barely fitting in the worn vinyl booth. Seraphina had noticed him the moment he walked in. How could she not? He moved like liquid darkness, all controlled power and predatory grace, his black hair falling across sharp cheekbones that could cut glass. But it was his eyes that made her breath catch. Golden. Not brown, not hazel, but pure molten gold that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed walls. When their gazes met across the dimly lit bar, something electric sparked in the air between them, something that made her wolf print birthmark on her shoulder blade burn with sudden, inexplicable heat. She'd had that mark since birth, a strange tattoo-like shape her foster parents could never explain, but tonight it felt alive, tingling with an energy she'd never experienced before. Marcus's second text arrived with a soft ping that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet bar. "Last warning, baby. You belong to me." Seraphina's fingers went numb, and the phone clattered to the floor behind the bar. She'd tried so hard to disappear, to become invisible in this city of rain and shadows, but somehow he always found her. The restraining order was just paper. Marcus Blackwood had connections, money, and a temper that had left her with scars she still hid beneath long sleeves and careful makeup. She bent to retrieve her phone, her dark auburn hair falling like a curtain around her face, when she heard the soft scrape of boots on the wooden floor. The golden-eyed stranger was approaching the bar, and with each step he took, the air grew thicker, charged with something wild and dangerous that made her pulse race in ways that terrified and thrilled her. "You're afraid," the stranger said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through her bones. It wasn't a question. Up close, he was even more overwhelming, at least 6.5 feet of solid muscle wrapped in a black leather jacket that had seen better days. His presence filled the space between them like smoke, dark and intoxicating, and when he leaned against the bar, she caught his scent. Pine forests after rain, something wild and untamed that made her knees weak and her wolf print birthmark burn hotter. "I can help you," he continued, those impossible golden eyes never leaving her face. "My name is Kieran Nightshade." When he spoke his name, something inside her chest responded, a recognition so deep and primal it felt like coming home and falling off a cliff at the same time. Before Seraphina could respond, before she could even process the strange pull she felt toward this dangerous stranger, the front door of Murphy's Tavern exploded open. Marcus stood silhouetted in the doorway, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the dive bar's grimy interior, his pale blue eyes scanning the room until they locked onto her cowering figure behind the bar. "There's my runaway bride," he said, his voice silk over steel as he stepped inside, and Seraphina felt the world tilt sideways. But something impossible happened in that moment. Kieran turned toward Marcus, and in the dim light, Seraphina could have sworn she saw his golden eyes flash with an otherworldly fire, and heard the softest sound escape his throat. A growl. Low, threatening, and absolutely inhuman. "Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in the Philippines, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are." Now, let's dive into the story. 6 months earlier, Seraphina had been a completely different person. She'd lived in Marcus's penthouse apartment overlooking the city, wearing designer dresses and attending charity galas where she smiled on command and spoke only when spoken to. The transformation from foster kid to trophy girlfriend had happened so gradually she barely noticed the cage being built around her. Marcus had found her working at a small bookstore in the arts district, charmed by what he called her natural beauty and untouched innocence. He'd swept her off her feet with expensive dinners and weekend trips to his family's estate, showering her with gifts and attention she'd never received in her 23 years of life. Looking back now, hiding behind Murphy's bar as her hands shook uncontrollably, she realized those gifts had all been chains, each kindness a link in the prison he'd built around her heart. The first time Marcus hit her, he'd cried afterward. Beautiful tears streaming down his perfect face as he begged for forgiveness, promising it would never happen again, swearing his love was so overwhelming it drove him to madness. Seraphina, who'd grown up in foster homes where love was conditional and affection was earned through compliance, believed him. She'd convinced herself that his jealousy was passion, his control was protection, his anger was just the flip side of how much he cared. The bruises were always in places her clothes would cover, and Marcus was careful to follow each episode with weeks of tender apologies and expensive peace offerings. Her foster care background had trained her to be grateful for any attention, to never rock the boat, to make herself smaller and smaller until she practically disappeared. By the time she realized what was happening, she'd already lost herself completely. The night she finally ran was the night Marcus's mask slipped entirely. She'd come home from her part-time job at a local animal shelter, one of the few things he'd allowed her to keep from her old life, to find him in their bedroom with her journal open in his hands. The journal where she'd been writing down her thoughts, her growing fears, her secret plans to leave. His face had gone completely calm, which was somehow more terrifying than his usual rage. "Planning a little trip, darling?" he'd asked in that soft voice that meant real danger. When she tried to explain, tried to backtrack and apologize, he'd grabbed her wrist so hard she heard bones creak. "You will never leave me, Seraphina," he'd whispered against her ear. "I will find you anywhere you go. You belong to me." That night, while he slept, she'd grabbed her few remaining possessions and disappeared into the Portland rain with nothing but $47 and a heart full of terror. 6 months of running had taught Seraphina things about herself she'd never known. She was stronger than she'd thought, more resourceful, braver when her survival depended on it. She'd slept in homeless shelters and cheap motels, worked cash jobs at diners and laundromats, always moving, always looking over her shoulder. Murphy's Tavern had been her longest stay anywhere, 3 whole months serving drinks to truckers and night shift workers who paid in crumpled bills and rarely asked questions. Old Murphy, the bar's ancient owner, had taken pity on her when she'd shown up soaking wet and desperate, offering her shifts that paid under the table and asking nothing about her past. For 3 months, she'd almost convinced herself she was safe, that maybe Marcus had given up, that maybe she could build something resembling a normal life in this forgotten corner of the city. But Marcus Blackwood never gave up on what he considered his property, and now he stood in the doorway of her sanctuary like a nightmare made flesh. Behind the bar, her birthmark burned against her shoulder blade as if responding to some unseen threat, while the golden-eyed stranger named Kieran positioned himself between her and Marcus with predatory grace. The air in the tavern had grown thick and electric, like the moments before a lightning strike, and Seraphina found herself caught between 2 forces she didn't understand. Marcus's smile was sharp as broken glass as he stepped further into the bar, his expensive shoes clicking against the worn wooden floor. "Hello, darling," he said, his voice carrying the promise of consequences. "Did you really think you could hide from me forever?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and Seraphina realized that everything she'd built in these past months was about to come crashing down around her. Marcus moved through Murphy's Tavern like he owned it, his designer suit and polished confidence making the dive bar look even shabbier by comparison. The few remaining customers suddenly found reasons to leave, dropping bills on their tables and hurrying out into the Portland night as if sensing the danger that had just walked through the door. Old Murphy himself had conveniently disappeared into the back office, leaving Seraphina alone with 2 men who seemed to be circling each other like predators. Marcus's pale blue eyes never left her face as he approached the bar, but she could feel his awareness of Kieran like electricity in the air. "You've been a very naughty girl, Sarah," Marcus said, his voice carrying that familiar undertone of controlled violence that made her stomach clench with remembered fear. "Do you have any idea how much trouble you've caused me? How many resources I've had to waste tracking down my runaway fiancé?" Kieran hadn't moved from his position near the bar, but somehow his presence seemed to fill the entire space. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than Marcus's but carried an authority that made the hair on Seraphina's arms stand up. "The lady doesn't want to go with you." The words were simple, but something in his tone suggested they carried weight beyond their surface meaning. Marcus's perfectly groomed head turned toward Kieran with slow, deliberate menace, and Seraphina watched her ex-boyfriend's face shift into an expression she knew meant serious trouble. "I'm sorry," Marcus said with poisonous politeness, "but I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Marcus Blackwood, and you're interfering in a private family matter." When he said his last name, Kieran's golden eyes flashed with something that looked almost like recognition, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Blackwood," Kieran repeated, and now his voice carried a growl that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "I should have known." The way he said it made Seraphina's wolf print birthmark burn hotter against her shoulder blade, and she pressed her hand against it instinctively, trying to ease the strange sensation. Marcus noticed the gesture immediately. He'd always been hyper-aware of her every movement, cataloging her reactions for future use. "Still got that ugly mark, I see," he said with casual cruelty. "Don't worry, darling. Once we're married, we'll have it removed. Can't have my wife walking around with some ridiculous wolf tattoo like she's part of some biker gang." His words hit Seraphina like physical blows, reminding her of all the ways he'd planned to change her, to erase every part of her identity that didn't fit his vision of the perfect trophy wife. But something strange was happening to Kieran. As Marcus spoke about removing her birthmark, the golden-eyed stranger's hands clenched into fists at his sides, and Seraphina could have sworn she heard a sound like grinding stone. When she looked closer, she saw something impossible. For just a moment, his fingernails looked longer, sharper, more like claws than human nails. The logical part of her mind insisted she was seeing things, that stress and fear were making her hallucinate, but every instinct she possessed was screaming that Kieran Nightshade was dangerous in ways she couldn't even comprehend. Yet somehow, impossibly, she felt safer with him nearby than she had in months. When their eyes met across the bar, she saw something in his golden gaze that looked almost like recognition. As if he knew something about her that she didn't know herself. The standoff between the two men stretched like a violin string about to snap, and Seraphina found herself caught in the middle of forces she didn't understand. Marcus took another step closer to the bar, his hand reaching into his jacket pocket in a gesture she knew meant he was armed. "Sarah, sweetheart," he said in that deceptively gentle tone, "come around the bar and let's go home. We have a wedding to plan." The words made her blood turn to ice, but before she could respond, Kieran moved. It was the fastest thing she'd ever seen. One moment he was standing still, the next he was between Marcus and the bar, his massive frame blocking her ex-boyfriend's path. "She's not going anywhere with you," Kieran said, and this time the growl in his voice was unmistakable. Behind the bar, Seraphina's birthmark felt like it was on fire, and somewhere in the distance, she could have sworn she heard the sound of howling wind, even though the night outside was perfectly still. Chapter 2, The Call of Something Wild. The moment Kieran positioned himself between Seraphina and Marcus, the very air in Murphy's tavern seemed to change. It grew thicker, charged with an energy that made the fluorescent lights flicker and buzz like angry insects. Seraphina pressed herself against the back wall behind the bar, her heart hammering so hard she was sure everyone could hear it, while her wolf print birthmark continued to burn against her shoulder blade with increasing intensity. She'd never experienced anything like this before. The mark had always been just a strange, tattoo-like shape she'd been born with, something that had made her different in foster homes where being different was dangerous. But now it felt alive, responding to something in the air between these two men that she couldn't identify but could feel in every cell of her body. Marcus's composed mask was beginning to slip, revealing glimpses of the rage that always simmered beneath his polished surface. His pale blue eyes had gone cold and flat, the expression she'd learned to fear more than his explosive anger because it meant he was calculating, planning something that would hurt. "Listen, friend," Marcus said, his voice dropping to that deadly quiet tone, "you seem like a reasonable man. Walk away now, and we can pretend this conversation never happened. Stay, and you'll learn why people in this city know better than to cross the Blackwood family." As he spoke, he shifted his jacket just enough to reveal the gun holstered beneath his arm, a subtle threat that made Seraphina's blood run cold. Marcus had always been careful never to show her his weapons directly, but she'd known they were there, had felt their presence like shadows in their shared space. But instead of backing down, Kieran did something that defied all logic. He laughed. It was a sound like distant thunder, rich and dark and completely unafraid, and it made something inside Seraphina's chest flutter with an emotion she couldn't name. "The Blackwood family," Kieran repeated, as if the words tasted bitter in his mouth. "Tell me, Marcus, does your family still think they run this territory? Still believe they can take what doesn't belong to them?" The way he emphasized the word territory sent chills down Seraphina's spine, and she noticed that his golden eyes had begun to glow with an inner light that seemed impossible under the harsh fluorescent bulbs. Marcus, meanwhile, had gone completely still, his face draining of color as if Kieran had said something that changed everything. The tension between the two men had escalated beyond anything Seraphina could understand, but she found herself drawn to Kieran in ways that terrified and thrilled her simultaneously. Every instinct she developed during months of running told her to be afraid of him. He was clearly dangerous, clearly capable of violence that would make Marcus look like a playground bully. But something deeper, some part of her that felt as old as the wolf print on her shoulder, whispered that Kieran would never hurt her. When he turned his head slightly to check on her, she caught his scent again, that intoxicating mix of pine forests and wild places that made her think of running beneath starlight and hunting by moonbeam. The thoughts were so vivid, so alien to her usual dreams of safety and security, that she gripped the edge of the bar counter until her knuckles went white. Marcus apparently decided that subtlety was no longer necessary. His hand moved toward his jacket pocket with the swift efficiency of someone accustomed to ending conversations with violence, but he never completed the motion. Kieran moved faster than human reflexes should allow, faster than Seraphina's eyes could track, and suddenly Marcus was pressed against the wall with Kieran's hand around his throat. But it wasn't a human hand anymore. Seraphina stared in shock at fingers that had elongated into claws, at golden eyes that now blazed with supernatural fire, at canine teeth that had grown sharp and deadly. The Nightshade Pack remembers your family's crimes, Blackwood, Kieran growled, his voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in her bones. Touch what's mine again, and I'll remind you why your ancestors learned to fear the full moon. The words hit Seraphina like lightning, illuminating a truth so impossible and terrifying that her mind reeled. Werewolves. They were talking about werewolves. As the supernatural revelation crashed over her like a tidal wave, Seraphina's birthmark erupted with such intense heat that she cried out, doubling over behind the bar as waves of searing pain rolled across her shoulder blade. But with the pain came something else, flashes of memory that weren't her own, glimpses of faces and places that felt familiar despite being completely foreign. She saw herself as a child, maybe 5 years old, standing in the office of her first social worker while adults in expensive suits whispered about genetic markers and breeding potential. The memory was so vivid, so real, that she could smell the stale coffee and hear the shuffle of paperwork that had sealed her fate. When the vision faded, she found herself staring up at old Murphy, who had emerged from his back office with an expression of grim determination etched across his weathered features. "About time you started remembering," Murphy said quietly, his voice carrying an authority she'd never heard before. Behind him, the back office door remained open, revealing glimpses of equipment that definitely didn't belong in a dive bar, computer monitors displaying what looked like genealogical charts, weapons that gleamed with more than mere steel, and photographs covering an entire wall like evidence in a criminal investigation. Seraphina struggled to her feet, her legs shaking as more memories crashed through her consciousness. Mrs. Rodriguez, the foster mother who'd called her demon child and locked her in closets for hours, she'd been paid extra to break Seraphina's spirit. The Hendersons, who'd seemed so kind until they suddenly decided she was too much trouble. After 6 months, they'd received a visit from men in black suits who'd made them an offer they couldn't refuse. "You've been watching me," Seraphina whispered, the pieces clicking together with horrifying clarity. "All these years, you've been watching me." Murphy nodded slowly, his eyes holding a sadness that spoke of decades of guilt and careful planning. 63 years I've been running this place," he said, gesturing toward the tavern that had been her sanctuary. 47 of those years, I've been waiting for you. The Blackwood family and their allies in the Covenant of Hunters have been orchestrating your entire life, child. Every placement, every move, every moment of suffering, it was all designed to shape you into the perfect vessel for their purposes. The words hit her like physical blows, rewriting every assumption she'd ever made about her tragic childhood. She'd always blamed herself for being unwanted, for being too difficult, too strange, too marked by whatever genetic quirk had given her the wolf print birthmark. Behind her, she could hear Kieran and Marcus engaged in their supernatural standoff, but Murphy's revelations had her complete attention as her world crumbled and rebuilt itself around this terrible new truth. "The foster care system," she said, her voice barely audible above the electrical humming that filled the air. "It was all fake? All of it?" Murphy's weathered hands clenched into fists, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd been carrying secrets for far too long. "Not fake, but corrupted. Infiltrated. The Covenant has been placing their people in key positions for over a century: social workers, judges, administrators, doctors. They've turned the system meant to protect vulnerable children into a supernatural trafficking network." As he spoke, more memories flooded back to her with crystalline clarity. The mandatory medical checkups that always included blood tests. The psychological evaluations that asked strange questions about dreams and instincts. The way certain foster families had seemed to be testing her, pushing her boundaries in very specific ways. "Mrs. Chen," Seraphina breathed, and Murphy's expression crumpled with grief that looked fresh despite the years that had passed. "Tell me about Mrs. Chen." The elderly bartender moved to the wall of photographs in his back office and pulled down a picture that made Seraphina's heart clench with remembered love and loss. It showed her at 15, laughing in the kitchen of the small house where she'd spent the happiest 8 months of her childhood, wrapped in the arms of a small Chinese woman whose kindness had been the first real warmth she'd ever known. Elena Chen was a pediatric nurse who'd figured out what was happening, Murphy said, his voice thick with emotion. She'd noticed patterns in the children who came through her ward, kids with unusual birthmarks, strange genetic markers, abilities that couldn't be explained by normal medicine. When she tried to adopt you permanently, tried to get you out of the system, the Blackwoods had her killed. The room seemed to spin around Seraphina as the full weight of this revelation crashed down on her. Mrs. Chen, the woman who'd taught her to cook dumplings and braid her hair, who'd made her feel like she belonged somewhere for the first time in her life, murdered because she tried to save one foster child from a system designed to destroy her. "The car accident," Seraphina whispered, remembering the devastating phone call that had shattered her teenage world. "They told me she died in a car accident." Murphy shook his head, his ancient eyes bright with unshed tears. "Made to look like an accident. The Covenant has people everywhere. Mechanics who can sabotage brake lines, coroners who can falsify reports, police who can bury investigations. Elena Chen died because she loved you enough to fight for you, and the Blackwoods couldn't allow that kind of interference in their long-term plans." As if summoned by the mention of his family name, Marcus's voice cut through the charged air of the tavern. "You're telling her about the program," he said, and Seraphina could hear the capitalized importance in the way he pronounced it. Kieran's grip on his throat had loosened enough to allow speech, but the werewolf's claws remained pressed against his skin as a very clear threat. "Good. It's time she understood her true value, her real purpose in this world." Marcus's pale blue eyes found hers across the room, and his smile was as cold as winter morning. "Did Murphy tell you about the others, darling? The dozens of children like you who've been processed through the program over the decades? Some of them were successful. They manifested their supernatural heritage at the right age and were harvested for their abilities. Others were failures, their bloodlines too diluted, their genetics too corrupted by human breeding to produce anything useful." The casual way he spoke about children being harvested made Seraphina's stomach turn, but Murphy stepped closer to her with protective intent. "There's more you need to know," the old bartender said, his voice carrying new urgency. "The reason I've been watching you, the reason I've stayed in this place for so long, I'm not just a bartender, child. I'm what's left of the Underground Railroad for supernatural children. When the Covenant started their breeding program, some of us fought back. We saved who we could, protected what bloodlines we could, tried to keep hope alive that someday someone would be strong enough to break their system entirely." As he spoke, Seraphina noticed movement in the shadows of his back office, other figures emerging from hidden spaces, people she'd served drinks to for months without realizing they were anything more than regular customers. "The network," Kieran said with obvious relief, recognizing the newcomers even as he maintained his hold on Marcus. "I wondered if any of you were still active in this territory." Murphy nodded grimly, and Seraphina watched in amazement as her safe little dive bar transformed into something that looked more like a supernatural command center. The regular customers, she'd thought she knew, revealed themselves as guardians who'd been watching over her, protecting her, preparing for this moment when her heritage would finally awaken. Tommy the trucker wasn't just a man who liked his whiskey neat, he was a former Covenant operative who'd turned against his employers when he discovered what they were really doing to the children in their care. Sarah, the quiet woman who came in every Tuesday for wine and never spoke to anyone, was actually a witch whose job had been to monitor Seraphina's supernatural development and alert the network when awakening was imminent. "All of you," Seraphina said, her voice breaking as the full scope of the deception and protection that had surrounded her entire life became clear. "You've all been watching me." Tommy stepped forward, his weathered face kind despite the weapons she could now see strapped beneath his jacket. "Not watching," he corrected gently. "Protecting." The Covenant marked you for harvest when you were 5 years old, but the network has been playing a longer game. Every foster family that hurt you, every social worker who moved you along, we documented it all. We've been building a case against the program for decades, waiting for someone strong enough to serve as both witness and weapon against them. The implications of his words hit her like lightning. She wasn't just a victim of the Covenant's supernatural trafficking system, she was their key to bringing the entire operation down. As if reading her thoughts, Marcus began to laugh, a sound that made the already charged air in the tavern crackle with malevolent energy. "You still don't understand, do you?" he said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who held all the winning cards. "The network, the Underground Railroad, all these people who think they've been protecting you, they've been doing exactly what we wanted them to do. Every move they've made, every safe house they've established, every guardian they've placed in your path, we've known about it all. The Covenant doesn't just infiltrate government systems, darling. We infiltrate resistance movements too." His words sent ice through Seraphina's veins as she looked around at the faces of people she'd begun to trust, wondering how many of them might be double agents working for the enemy. But Murphy's reaction told her everything she needed to know about the truth of Marcus's claims. The old bartender's face went white as bone, and his hands began to shake with what looked like fear or rage or both. "Impossible," he whispered, but the certainty in his voice was cracking like ice in spring. "We've been so careful, so thorough in our screening process." Marcus's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp for a human mouth. "Did you really think the Blackwood family maintained power for over 2 centuries by being careless? We've had operatives in your network since the beginning, feeding us information, guiding your decisions, making sure you protected our investment while thinking you were fighting against us." As he spoke, Seraphina noticed that several of the guardians in Murphy's back office had quietly positioned themselves near exits, their body language shifting from protective to potentially threatening. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow, but it was Kieran's voice that cut through her despair like a blade through darkness. "Not all of them," he said with absolute certainty, his golden eyes finding hers across the room. "I can smell truth and lies, Seraphina. Most of these people genuinely care about you, genuinely want to protect you. But Marcus is right about one thing: the Covenant has been playing a longer game than anyone realized." As if to prove his point, the werewolf's nostrils flared as he scented the air around them, and his expression darkened with predatory fury. "2 of them," he growled, his claws extending further against Marcus's throat. 2 double agents in this room, feeding information to the enemy for years. The revelation split the group like lightning, as guardians who'd worked together for decades suddenly found themselves eyeing each other with suspicion and fear. But before accusations could begin flying, Seraphina felt her birthmark explode with heat so intense it drove her to her knees behind the bar. This time, the memories that flooded her consciousness weren't random flashes from her childhood, they were systematic, organized, like files being downloaded directly into her brain. She saw the complete structure of the Covenant's breeding program, the genealogical charts that mapped supernatural bloodlines going back centuries, the facilities where children like her were taken for processing. And she saw something else, something that made her blood run cold with terror and rage in equal measure. "There are others," she gasped, struggling to her feet as the visions continued to pour through her consciousness. "Right now, tonight, there are other children in the system. Dozens of them, being moved to harvest facilities, being prepared for." She couldn't finish the sentence as images of surgical tables and extraction procedures flooded her mind. Murphy stepped closer, his weathered face etched with desperate hope. "You can see them? You can see where they are?" Seraphina nodded, her wolf print birthmark now glowing with silver light that was visible even through her shirt. "The awakening, it's not just giving me abilities. It's connecting me to every supernatural child in the Covenant system. I can feel them, Murphy. I can feel how afraid they are." The room fell silent except for the electrical humming that seemed to be growing stronger by the moment, and Seraphina realized that her transformation was affecting the tavern's very infrastructure. But more importantly, she realized that everything that had happened to her, every moment of suffering, every foster home that had broken her spirit, every loss that had taught her to survive, had been preparation for this moment. Not the moment when she would be harvested by the covenant, but the moment when she would become strong enough to bring their entire system crashing down around them. As she looked around at the faces surrounding her, guardians real and false, a werewolf who'd claimed her as his own, and the man who'd orchestrated her torment, she felt something shift inside her chest. Not just awakening supernatural abilities, but awakening to her true purpose in this hidden war between those who would exploit the supernatural and those who would protect it. Chapter 3: The Alpha's Claim. Seraphina's world tilted sideways as she stared at Kieran's transformed hand wrapped around Marcus's throat. The claws were real, long, curved, and sharp enough to slice through flesh like paper. His golden eyes blazed with an inner fire that had nothing to do with the flickering fluorescent lights overhead, and when he spoke, she could see fangs that definitely hadn't been there moments before. Every rational part of her mind screamed that this was impossible, that werewolves existed only in movies and books, but the evidence was right in front of her. More unsettling than the supernatural display was her own reaction to it. Instead of terror, she felt a strange sense of rightness, as if seeing Kieran's true nature was like finding a missing piece of herself she hadn't known was lost. Marcus, pinned against the wall like a butterfly in a display case, was experiencing his own revelation. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked genuinely afraid. His pale blue eyes were wide with shock and something that might have been recognition, as if Kieran's words about the Nightshade Pack and Blackwood family crimes had awakened memories he tried to bury. "You're supposed to be extinct," Marcus whispered, his voice strained by the pressure on his throat. "The Blackwoods wiped out your bloodline decades ago." Kieran's grip tightened, and Seraphina watched more claws emerge from his fingertips, pressing just hard enough against Marcus's skin to draw thin lines of blood. "Rumors of our extinction were greatly exaggerated," Kieran growled. "But your family's debt remains unpaid." Behind the bar, Seraphina's birthmark was now burning so intensely it felt like molten metal against her skin. She pressed her hand against her shoulder blade, trying to ease the sensation, when something extraordinary happened. The moment her palm made contact with the wolf print mark, images flooded her mind, not memories, but something deeper, older, like genetic echoes from a life she'd never lived. She saw forests under moonlight, felt the sensation of running on 4 legs instead of 2, heard the howling of a pack that called to something wild in her blood. The visions were so vivid, so real, that for a moment she forgot where she was. When the images faded, both men were staring at her with expressions that ranged from shocked to hungry to absolutely terrified. "Impossible," Marcus breathed, his eyes fixed on her face with a new kind of intensity. "She's just a broken little foster kid. There's nothing special about her." But his words lacked conviction, and Seraphina could see the calculating look creeping back into his expression, the look that meant he was reassessing her value, figuring out new ways to possess and control her. Kieran, meanwhile, had released Marcus and taken a step toward the bar, his transformed features slowly returning to human normal. But his golden eyes never left Seraphina's face, and when he spoke, his voice carried a reverence that made her heart skip. "You felt it, didn't you?" he asked softly. "The awakening. Your wolf recognizing mine." The words should have sounded insane, but they resonated in her chest like a tuning fork struck against crystal. The moment of supernatural revelation was shattered by the sound of Marcus straightening his expensive suit and pulling out his phone. "This changes nothing," he said, though his voice shook slightly. "Sarah belongs to me, whether she's human or something else. My family has contracts, legal documents, investments in her future." He began dialing a number, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "I'm calling for backup. You may be stronger than me, Wolf, but you're alone, and I have resources you can't imagine." As he spoke, Seraphina felt something shift inside her chest, not fear, but anger. Pure, cleansing rage at the idea that she could be owned, contracted, traded like property whether she was human or something more. For the first time in her life, she felt powerful enough to fight back, and when she stepped out from behind the bar to stand beside Kieran, her birthmark pulsed with warmth that felt like coming home. Marcus's phone call lasted exactly 30 seconds, but Seraphina could see the confidence flowing back into his posture with each word he spoke. "Yes, it's confirmed," he said into the device, his eyes never leaving her face. "The asset has manifested. Send the containment team to Murphy's Tavern immediately." The clinical way he referred to her as an asset made her stomach turn, but it was the word containment that sent ice through her veins. Whatever Marcus had planned for her, it was worse than anything she'd imagined during their relationship. Kieran moved closer to her side, and she could feel the heat radiating from his body like a furnace, could smell that intoxicating scent of wild places that made her wolf print birthmark tingle with recognition. "Containment team?" Seraphina whispered, her voice barely audible above the buzzing fluorescent lights. Marcus smiled then, the expression as cold and sharp as winter morning, and she realized she was seeing him clearly for the first time. Not the charming businessman who'd swept her off her feet, not even the controlling abuser who'd made her life hell, but something far more calculating and dangerous. "Oh, darling," he said with poisonous sweetness, "did you really think I found you by accident? That I just happened to fall in love with a random foster kid working in a bookstore?" His laugh was like breaking glass. "The Blackwood family has been tracking your bloodline for generations, waiting for the wolf gene to manifest. You're the last of a very special line, Sarah, and we've invested far too much in you to let you run wild." The implications of his words hit her like physical blows. Every moment of their relationship had been a lie, every kindness calculated, every gift part of a larger plan she'd never suspected. But worse than the betrayal was the realization that she'd never been free, not even before she met Marcus. Her entire life had been observed, guided, manipulated by people who saw her as nothing more than a breeding experiment. Kieran's hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers warm and solid and reassuringly real, and when she looked up into his golden eyes, she saw something that made her breath catch. Not calculation or manipulation, but recognition. The look of someone who saw her as she truly was and wasn't afraid. Outside Murphy's Tavern, the sound of approaching vehicles cut through the Portland night. Black SUVs with tinted windows pulled up to the curb, disgorging men in tactical gear who moved with military precision. Marcus's backup had arrived faster than should have been possible, which meant they'd been waiting nearby, prepared for this exact scenario. "You see?" Marcus said, straightening his tie with practiced calm. "The Blackwood family doesn't leave things to chance. We've been planning for this moment since the day you were born." Through the grimy windows, Seraphina could see more armed figures taking positions around the building, cutting off every escape route with efficient brutality. But Kieran didn't seem concerned by the overwhelming odds. If anything, his posture relaxed, becoming more predatory as the tactical team surrounded the building. "Marcus," he said conversationally, "has anyone ever told you that the Blackwood family's intelligence network isn't as comprehensive as you think?" Before Marcus could respond, Kieran tilted his head back and released a sound that made every window in the tavern vibrate. It wasn't quite human, wasn't quite animal, but something in between that seemed to reach into Seraphina's chest and call to parts of her she'd never known existed. The howl echoed through the night air, bouncing off buildings and disappearing into the darkness, and within moments, it was answered. From every direction, other voices joined the chorus, deep, wild, and absolutely unafraid. Marcus's face went white as he realized his containment team was about to become the contained. But as the responding howls grew closer, Marcus's expression shifted from fear to something far more complex, recognition mixed with disbelief and a hunger that made Seraphina's skin crawl. His pale blue eyes fixed on Kieran with laser intensity, studying his face as if seeing him for the first time despite their earlier confrontation. "Impossible," Marcus breathed, his voice carrying a tremor that had nothing to do with the supernatural sounds surrounding them. "The Nightshade bloodline was eliminated 23 years ago. We made sure of it." The way he emphasized "we" sent chills down Seraphina's spine, but it was Kieran's reaction that truly terrified her. The werewolf's golden eyes blazed with sudden fury so intense it seemed to burn the air around them, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made the building's foundation vibrate. "You made sure of it," Kieran repeated, each word sharp as a blade. "Tell me, Marcus, do you remember the night your family burned the royal compound to the ground? Do you remember the screams of children who never had a chance to defend themselves?" As he spoke, his form seemed to grow larger, more imposing, and Seraphina could see the shadow of something ancient and powerful moving beneath his human appearance. "My parents, my siblings, my aunts and uncles, my cousins, all dead because the Blackwood family decided that werewolves needed human oversight. All murdered because your ancestors believed they could improve on nature's design." The raw pain in his voice made Seraphina's heart clench, but it was the implications of his words that made her head spin with shock. "Royal compound," she whispered, the pieces clicking together with devastating clarity. "You're not just an alpha. You're..." Kieran turned to her, and in his golden eyes she saw centuries of grief and rage and desperate hope. "I am Kieran Ravencrest Nightshade, last surviving prince of the North American Wolf Territories, heir to a throne that no longer exists." His voice carried the weight of noble titles and lost kingdoms, but also something deeper, the loneliness of someone who'd been carrying an impossible burden for decades. "The pack you saw responding to my call aren't just local wolves, Seraphina. They're the scattered remnants of the Royal Guard, the survivors who've spent the last 23 years hiding in human cities, waiting for their prince to reclaim what was stolen from our people." Marcus's phone buzzed with an incoming call, and when he answered it, his voice carried a new kind of excitement that made Seraphina's blood run cold. "Yes, I'm certain," he said into the device, his eyes never leaving Kieran's face. "Kieran Ravencrest Nightshade, the Crown Prince himself. Confirmed alive and in custody." The casual way he spoke about custody when Kieran was clearly free and dangerous made her realize that Marcus's confidence wasn't misplaced. He had a plan that went far beyond what they could see. "Activate the royal protocol," Marcus continued into his phone. "Deploy the electromagnetic field generator specifically calibrated for Nightshade bloodline resonance. The council will want him delivered alive for the public execution." The words hit the air like hammer blows, and Seraphina watched Kieran's face go white as bone as the full scope of the trap became clear. "You see, darling," Marcus said, ending his call and smiling at Seraphina with poisonous sweetness, "you were never the primary target tonight. Oh, you're valuable, the last of your bloodline, perfect for our breeding programs, but you're nothing compared to the prize standing beside you. Do you have any idea what the bounty on a Nightshade Royal is worth? What the supernatural community would pay to see the last symbol of werewolf independence publicly executed?" As he spoke, Seraphina could hear new vehicles arriving outside, heavier than the tactical teams, carrying equipment that hummed with electrical malevolence. Through the windows, she watched technicians in hazmat suits begin deploying devices that looked like science fiction made manifest, gleaming metal towers that pulsed with blue energy and made her birthmark burn with instinctive revulsion. "The electromagnetic field generators," Kieran said grimly, recognizing the threat immediately. "But these aren't standard anti-werewolf technology. They're specifically designed to disrupt Nightshade bloodline abilities, our enhanced speed, our pack communication, our transformation capabilities." As the devices powered up around Murphy's Tavern, Seraphina could feel something fundamental change in the air pressure, like being trapped in a bubble that was slowly closing in on them. Kieran's golden eyes began to flicker as the electromagnetic fields interfered with his supernatural abilities, and she realized that whatever advantage his pack might have had was being systematically neutralized by technology designed specifically to capture him. Murphy emerged from his back office, moving with urgent purpose as he surveyed the supernatural siege equipment being deployed around his tavern. "Royal protocol," he muttered, his weathered face grim with recognition. "Haven't seen that since the night of burning crowns." The old bartender's eyes found Kieran's, and Seraphina saw decades of shared history pass between them in a single glance. "Your Highness," Murphy said formally, the title carrying weight despite the humble surroundings, "the network has been waiting for your return, but not like this. not trapped like an animal for their entertainment. As he spoke, Seraphina began to understand that Murphy's role in the supernatural underground was far more significant than she'd realized. He wasn't just protecting foster children from the Covenant's breeding programs, he was coordinating resistance efforts for the Werewolf royal family. "The Knight of Burning Crowns," Marcus said with obvious satisfaction, as if the historical reference pleased him immensely. Such a poetic name for what was really just efficient pest control. "Did you know, Sarah, that your boyfriend's family used to rule over vast territories across North America?" Werewolf packs from Alaska to Mexico acknowledged Nightshade authority, paid tribute to the royal court, lived according to laws that had been established for centuries. His pale blue eyes glittered with malicious pleasure as he continued his history lesson. "But the Blackwood family and our allies in the Covenant recognized that such power in the hands of supernatural creatures was dangerous to human civilization. So we did what humans have always done when faced with superior predators. We adapted, we innovated, we eliminated the threat." The electromagnetic field generators reached full power with a sound like reality tearing, and Seraphina watched in horror as Kieran staggered, his supernatural abilities being stripped away by technology designed specifically to target his royal bloodline. But it wasn't just affecting him. Through the windows, she could see his pack members collapsing as the fields disrupted their connection to their prince, leaving them disoriented and vulnerable to Marcus's tactical teams. 23 years of research, Marcus continued conversationally, as if discussing the weather rather than genocide. 23 years of studying Nightshade genetics, learning how your bloodline's abilities function, developing countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize royal werewolf capabilities. Your family's DNA was quite informative, Your Highness, especially the samples we collected from your younger sister before she died. The mention of his sister broke something fundamental in Kieran's composure. Despite the electromagnetic fields hampering his abilities, he lunged toward Marcus with a roar of pure rage that shattered every remaining window in Murphy's tavern. But the fields did their work. Instead of supernatural speed and strength, Kieran moved with merely human capabilities, and Marcus's tactical team was ready for him. Tranquilizer darts flew through the air, striking him from multiple angles, and Seraphina watched the last prince of the werewolves collapse to his knees as chemicals designed specifically for his physiology flooded his system. Carefully calibrated sedatives, Marcus explained to her with clinical detachment. Enough to incapacitate a Nightshade royal without killing him. The council wants him conscious for the execution ceremony. But as Kieran fell, something unexpected happened. His hand found Seraphina's ankle, and the moment their skin made contact, her wolf print birthmark exploded with silver light so intense it overloaded the electromagnetic field generators. Sparks flew from the devices as they struggled to contain power they hadn't been designed to handle, and through their failing fields, Seraphina felt something new awakening in her consciousness. Not just her own supernatural abilities, but an echo of royal bloodline power transmitted through Kieran's touch, memories and knowledge and strength that had been passed down through generations of werewolf royalty. The connection lasted only seconds before the tactical team forced them apart, but it was enough to plant seeds of power that would grow beyond anything the Covenant could control. "Interesting," Marcus said, studying the smoking remains of his electromagnetic field generators with scientific fascination rather than alarm. "The hybrid appears to have some resistance to our royal-specific technology. We'll need to adjust our containment protocols accordingly." As he spoke, more vehicles arrived outside, armored trucks that disgorged figures in elaborate ceremonial armor bearing symbols that made Murphy hiss with recognition. "The High Council's executioners," the old bartender whispered, his voice thick with dread. "They've come to perform the ritual themselves." Through the broken windows, Seraphina could see the newcomers setting up equipment that looked less like technology and more like medieval torture devices updated for supernatural prey. "You see, darling," Marcus said, gripping her chin and forcing her to watch as Kieran was loaded onto a transport gurney, "tonight isn't just about reclaiming my runaway fiancé. Tonight is about making history. The last Nightshade Royal will die in front of representatives from every supernatural community in North America, and his death will send a clear message about who really controls this continent." His smile was sharp as winter wind as he continued. And you, my dear hybrid, will have a front row seat to watch your protector's execution before we begin your own processing. After all, what's the point of having power if no one fears it? The casual cruelty in his voice made her stomach turn, but it was the sight of Kieran being wheeled toward the execution transport that broke her heart entirely. As the tactical teams prepared to move their captives, Murphy stepped closer to Seraphina with something that looked like hope flickering in his ancient eyes. "Your Highness may be captured," he whispered urgently, "but the crown's power lives on. The royal bloodline carries memories, child, every king and queen who came before, every decision that shaped our people, every secret that could bring down the covenant if it fell into the right hands." His words were barely audible above the sounds of preparation outside, but they carried weight that made her birthmark tingle with possibility. What you felt when he touched you, that was just the beginning. The crown recognizes worthiness, not just blood. And sometimes, the most unlikely person becomes exactly who their people need. The implications of his words hit her like lightning as she realized that her connection to Kieran might be more than romantic attraction or supernatural bonding. It might be the key to reclaiming everything the Covenant had stolen from the werewolf people. The moment was shattered by Marcus's hand closing around her arm with bruising force. "Time to go, darling," he said with false gentleness that couldn't hide the violence underneath. "Your prince awaits his crown of thorns, and you have a very important role to play in the ceremony. After all, what's a royal execution without the proper motivation?" As he dragged her toward the door, Seraphina caught one last glimpse of Kieran's unconscious form being secured in the transport vehicle, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Not just awakening supernatural power, but awakening purpose. The girl who'd cowered behind Murphy's bar was gone forever, and in her place stood someone who might just be strong enough to save a prince, topple an empire, and reclaim a throne that had been stolen by those who mistook cruelty for strength. The real war was just beginning, and this time, the hunters were about to discover what it meant to become the hunted. Chapter 4, The Pack Awakens. The first wolf materialized from the shadows behind Murphy's tavern like liquid moonlight given form. Massive and silver gray, it moved with predatory grace that made the armed men stumble backward in shock and terror. More wolves followed, emerging from alleyways and rooftops, flowing through the Portland night like a tide of fur and fangs and burning eyes. Seraphina pressed herself against the bar window, watching in awe as what had been a trap designed to capture her transformed into something that looked more like a medieval siege. Marcus's tactical team, for all their military training and high-tech equipment, clearly hadn't prepared to face actual werewolves in their animal forms. Inside the tavern, Marcus was frantically shouting orders into his phone, but Seraphina could hear the panic creeping into his voice as his carefully laid plans disintegrated around him. "Fall back to defensive positions," he barked. "Use the silver rounds, damn it. Where's the backup team?" Through the windows, she watched his men try to regroup, but they were clearly outmatched. The wolves moved like shadows, disappearing and reappearing with supernatural speed, their howls echoing off the buildings in a symphony of wild music that made her birthmark burn with increasing intensity. Kieran stood beside her, no longer bothering to hide his true nature, his golden eyes tracking the movements of his pack with alpha authority. "How many?" she whispered, amazed by the sheer number of wolves surrounding the building. Kieran's smile was sharp as a blade, revealing those dangerous canine teeth that somehow didn't frighten her the way they should. "Enough," he said simply. "The Nightshade pack may have been driven underground by your boyfriend's family, but we never stopped existing. We just learned to hide better." As if to emphasize his point, another group of wolves appeared on the neighboring rooftop, their eyes reflecting the streetlights like stars. Marcus's containment team was now completely surrounded, their high-tech weapons useless against an enemy that could disappear into shadow and reappear behind them without warning. The largest wolf, a massive black creature with silver markings around its muzzle, approached the front entrance of Murphy's tavern. When it looked through the glass door, its eyes met Kieran's in what was clearly communication beyond human understanding. Kieran nodded once, then turned to Seraphina with an expression that managed to be both gentle and absolutely fierce. "The choice is yours, he said quietly. My pack can scatter Marcus's men, but that won't solve the larger problem. The Blackwood family will keep hunting you, keep sending teams, until they have what they want. Or... He paused, his golden eyes holding hers with magnetic intensity. You can come with us. Accept what you are, learn to be what you were born to be. But once you make that choice, there's no going back to the human world. Before Seraphina could respond, Marcus made the decision for her. Desperate and cornered, he pulled his weapon and aimed it directly at her heart. If I can't have her, he snarled, then no one can. The moment stretched like eternity, Marcus's finger tightening on the trigger, Kieran moving faster than humanly possible to intercept, and Seraphina finally understanding that her old life was ending whether she chose it or not. But as the gun fired, something extraordinary happened. Time seemed to slow, and Seraphina felt her birthmark explode with heat so intense it was like being struck by lightning. The pain drove her to her knees, but with it came power, raw, wild, transformative power that she'd never imagined she possessed. When she looked up, Marcus was staring at her in shock and fear, because the bullet that should have killed her was embedded in the wooden wall 3 feet to her left, deflected by forces that defied physics and embraced magic. The transformation hit Seraphina like a tidal wave of sensation she had no context for understanding. Every nerve ending in her body caught fire as her birthmark spread across her skin like living artwork, the wolf print pattern expanding from her shoulder blade to cover her arms and back in intricate designs that glowed with soft silver light. She could feel her bones shifting, not painfully but with a strange sense of rightness, as if her body was finally becoming what it had always been meant to be. Her vision sharpened until she could see dust motes dancing in the fluorescent light, her hearing expanded until she could detect heartbeats 3 blocks away, and her sense of smell exploded into a symphony of information that told her everything about everyone in the room. Marcus stumbled backward, his expensive suit rumpled and his perfect composure completely shattered. Impossible, he breathed, staring at her with a mixture of awe and terror that would have been satisfying if she hadn't been overwhelmed by her own transformation. The gene was supposed to be dormant. Our research showed it would take generations to manifest again. Kieran moved to stand protectively beside her, and she could smell his scent with new intensity, not just pine forests and wild places, but alpha strength and absolute loyalty and something deeper that made her newly awakened wolf purr with recognition. Your research was wrong, Kieran said softly, his hand finding hers and grounding her as power continued to surge through her transformed body. Through the windows of Murphy's Tavern, she could see the standoff between the Nightshade Pack and Marcus's tactical team reaching its breaking point. The wolves had formed a perfect circle around the building, their eyes glowing in the darkness like fallen stars, while the armed men huddled in defensive positions that looked increasingly futile. But Seraphina's enhanced hearing picked up something that made her blood run cold, the sound of additional vehicles approaching, more heavily armed than the first wave. Marcus heard them too, and his confident smile returned as reinforcements arrived. Did you really think this was all we brought? He asked, straightening his tie with renewed arrogance. The Blackwood family has been hunting your kind for generations. We know how to plan for every contingency. The new arrivals weren't just more tactical teams, they were specialists. Seraphina could smell silver weapons and hear the high-pitched whine of devices designed specifically for supernatural combat. Through her enhanced vision, she watched as they deployed equipment that looked like something from a science fiction movie, all gleaming metal and pulsing lights that made her skin crawl with instinctive revulsion. Electromagnetic field generators, Kieran explained grimly, recognizing the threat immediately. They prevent shape-shifting, trap us in whatever form we're in when the field activates. If my pack gets caught in human form, they'll be helpless. If they're trapped as wolves, they can't access their human intelligence. But as the specialized equipment powered up and Marcus's forces prepared for their final assault, something unexpected happened. Old Murphy emerged from his back office, moving with surprising speed for a man his age, and began shutting down every electrical system in the tavern. The fluorescent lights died, plunging them into darkness broken only by the silver glow emanating from Seraphina's transformed skin. Been waiting 60 years for this night, Murphy said quietly, and when he turned toward them, his eyes reflected the dim light with an unmistakably lupin gleam. Time to show these Blackwood bastards what happens when they threaten Pack family. As he spoke, Seraphina felt something click into place in her understanding. Murphy wasn't just a kind old bar owner who'd given her shelter, he was Pack, had been watching over her, protecting her, waiting for her to awaken. She'd never been as alone as she'd thought. But as the silver patterns on her skin pulsed with increasing intensity, something far more profound began happening to Seraphina's consciousness. The transformation wasn't just awakening dormant werewolf genetics, it was breaking down barriers that had been placed on her soul itself. Memories that weren't her own began flooding through her mind like water through a broken dam, and she saw herself in a time before cities, before civilization, when the world was young and the boundary between human and wolf was thin as moonlight. She was running through primordial forests on 4 legs that felt more natural than 2, leading pack hunts beneath stars that had different names, speaking to wolves in languages that predated human speech by millennia. "The seal is breaking," Murphy whispered, his voice thick with awe and terror in equal measure. "After 3,000 years, the wolf mother is finally remembering who she was." His words hit Seraphina like lightning as more ancient memories crashed through her consciousness. She saw herself as she had been in her first life, not human, not werewolf, but something in between, something original and pure that had existed before the 2 species had diverged. She had been the bridge between worlds, the first to discover that humans and wolves could share the same soul, the one who had taught others the sacred transformation that bound their essences together. But with the memories came something else, the devastating knowledge of how that first life had ended, and who had been responsible for her death. Chapter 5. Marcus's face had gone white as bone, and when he spoke, his voice carried a tremor that had nothing to do with the supernatural energy crackling through the tavern. "It's not possible," he said, but the certainty in his words was cracking like ice in spring. "The Wolf Mother is a myth. A legend. The original texts were destroyed centuries ago." But even as he denied it, Seraphina could see recognition dawning in his pale blue eyes, and she realized that on some level, he had always known what she was. The Blackwood family's obsession with her bloodline wasn't about breeding programs or genetic research. It was about preventing this exact moment, when the first werewolf would remember her true nature and the betrayal that had ended her original existence. "You killed me," Seraphina said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the building's foundation vibrate. The words came from knowledge that predated her current incarnation, memories sealed away from millennia now pouring through her consciousness like molten gold. 3,000 years ago, when I tried to bring peace between your ancestors and mine, you invited me to a treaty meeting and then poisoned me with wolfsbane." As she spoke, the silver patterns on her skin began forming recognizable shapes, ancient symbols that told the story of the first pack, the original transformation, the sacred bond between human and wolf that had been twisted into fear and hatred by those who couldn't understand it. Marcus backed toward the door, his composure completely shattered as the full implications of her awakening became clear. "The compulsion spells," he whispered, his hand moving to a pendant beneath his shirt that glowed with sickly green light. "They should have kept you docile, kept the memories locked away until we could reinforce the soul bindings." His confession hit the air like a physical blow, and Seraphina realized that every emotion she'd ever felt for him had been artificially induced. The love, the attraction, even the dependency that had kept her trapped in their relationship, all of it had been magical manipulation designed to keep the wolf mother's soul contained and powerless. The violation was so complete, so thorough, that for a moment her rage threatened to consume everything in its path.